Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Peyton Stapp, and this is Changing the Subject, Taking Action Against Bias in Library Subject Headings. Subject headings are standardized words and phrases assigned to library materials to describe what they're about. They're the vocabulary that powers topical searching in a library catalog, the reason you can search climate change and get a curated list of relevant books rather than just keyword matches. The most widely adopted subject heading system in the United States is the Library of Congress Subject Headings, or LCSH. But like any system built and maintained by human beings, LCSH carries the values and blind spots of the people who created it. And for most of its history, that meant a very narrow perspective. Western, English-speaking, Christian, and predominantly white and male. That's what we'll be digging into today. The Library of Congress subject headings were first published in 1898, a time when the United States was a very different place, and when the question of whose knowledge counted and whose language was used to describe it wasn't really a question at all. LCSH was built by and for a specific worldview. Scholars sometimes use the acronym WEIRD, Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, to describe the cultural myths that dominated institutions like this one. That lens shapes every decision about what to name, how to categorize, and whose terminology was treated as neutral and universal. When the people building a system all shared the same cultural perspective, they don't see their perspective as a perspective. They see it as the default of life. Defaults can be invisible until someone from outside them comes along and says, "This doesn't describe everyone." One such moment came in 1931 when a librarian named Sanford Berman published a book called Prejudices and Antipathies, a tract on the LCSH subject heads concerning people. Berman's critique was systematic. Working as a librarian in Zambia, he had encountered the term kafir, which is known to be a racial slur, in the Library of Congress subject heading, and that discovery sent him back through the entire system looking for more. What he found was extensive. He documented hundreds of objectionable headings across race, religion, gender, sexuality, and national origin. For each one, he proposed a specific remedy. In an American society that was beginning to confront its narrow perspective compared to its diverse population, the profession began to reckon with the fact that the controlled vocabulary it had trusted for decades was not neutral. It had never been neutral. And neutrality, Berman argued, was not something a cataloging system could claim when it was built by and for people who were anything but neutral themselves. Ultimately, more than a third of the bias that Berman identified in 1971 was still sitting in the Library of Congress subject heading by about 30 years later, largely untouched. Progress was real, but it was slow and uneven. Bias in Library of Congress subject headings generally falls into 5 very broad categories. These categories are racial and ethnic bias, anti-immigration language, sexism, the pathologizing and erasure of LGBTQIA+ identities, and the centering of Christianity as a default to religion. Examples on your screen illustrate each one. The takeaway here is that bias in LCSH is structural. It's baked into a system that was built without community input, maintained without adequate mechanisms for correction, and treated as authoritative for over a century. But here's the thing about structural problems. They require structural solutions, and those solutions are now available to us as library professionals. The Library of Congress subject headings have changed before, and it can change again. The question is how we go about participating in that change. One of the most well-documented examples of this bias being recognized, publicized, and ultimately reconciled begins with a college student just trying to do her homework. In 2013, Dartmouth College student Melissa Padilla was researching undocumented students for a class paper. She went to her university library's online catalog, typed in her search terms, and started pulling up books and articles when she noticed something. Nearly every item she found was categorized under the same subject heading, illegal aliens. For Kadia, who had been undocumented herself until enrolling in darkness, that was her library, an institution built on the promise of access and inclusion, using dehumanizing language to describe people like her. She brought it to her fellow students in co-fired the Dartmouth Coalition for Immigration Reform, Equality, and Dreamers, and they decided to do something about it. Co-fired worked with Dartmouth librarians Amy Whipple, Jill Barron, and Cataloging and Metadata Services librarian John DeSantis to research the issue and build a formal case. A single library can't simply change an LCSH on its own because subject heading authority is held at the national level at the Library of Congress. So the students and libraries prepared a formal SACO proposal, which is a subject authority cooperative program request, asking the Library of Congress to replace illegal aliens with a more humanizing term, undocumented immigrant. It was very significant as an undertaking. A SACO proposal requires documented literary warrant, evidence that the proposed term is actually used in the literature, along with clear rationale for the change. The Dartmouth did all of that work very carefully and submit the proposal in 2014. Later that same year, the Library of Congress rejected that proposal. The stated reason was that undocumented immigrants is not an exact synonym for illegal alien. Not all undocumented people are or intend to be immigrants, and not all of them lack documentation entirely. The Library of Congress argued that the proposed replacement did not adequately cover the full scope of the existing heading. At the ALA Midwinter meeting in January 2016, the ALA Council, inspired by the Dartmouth Library's story, adopted a formal resolution calling on the LC to change the subject heading to illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants. This resolution is the profession speaking with a collective voice, which signals to the Library of Congress that this isn't a fringe concern. It's a mainstream professional consensus, and that increases the pressure on LC to act. In February 2016, LC convened a formal meeting of stakeholders to deliberate on the heading. By March, LC made the decision. The Library of Congress announced that it would cancel the subject heading illegal aliens and replace it with two new headings, non-citizen and unauthorized immigration. In its official statement, LC finally acknowledged that the terms illegal and alien, when used in reference to people, had acquired derogatory connotations over time and became increasingly associated with nativist and discriminatory sentiments. It was a landmark decision. For a brief moment, it looked like the system had worked. Then Congress stepped in. Republican lawmakers introduced multiple attempts to block the revision. Ultimately, in a provision attached to the House's 2017 appropriations bill, lawmakers instructed LC to maintain subject headings that reflect terminology used in federal immigration law, where the phrase illegal alien does appear. It was the first time in U.S. history that Congress had ever intervened in a Library of Congress subject heading change. Ultimately, LC backed down. In May 2016, the library announced it would conduct a survey and study the issue further, and then went silent. But libraries didn't wait. Over the next 5 years, at least 40 libraries and library systems, including Ivy League institutions and large consortia, revised the heading in their own catalogs independently, proving that local remediation works at scale. In November 2021, 8 years after Melissa Padilla first noticed the heading in her library's catalog, LC finally announced its decision. Illegal aliens would be replaced with two headings, non-citizens and illegal immigration. The response from the library community was mixed. Non-citizens were broadly welcomed. But illegal immigration replacing illegal aliens was seen by many as a compromise that still criminalizes the act rather than using the community-preferred undocumented immigrant. The word illegal, describing a community of people, still remains. This case tells us a lot about how the change happens and doesn't happen in systems as large and entrenched as the Library of Congress subject heading. It took 8 years of both individual and institutional pressure, but change also happened. And it happened because people at every level of the profession chose to act through a formal SAFER process, through local remediation, and through national advocacy. The illegal aliens case gives us a concrete example of the impact of biased vocabulary, but we should step back and talk about why this matters more broadly. The most immediate and practical consequence of the biased subject heading is a discoverability problem. When headings don't match the language communities use to describe themselves, patrons either can't find what they're looking for or they find it through a term that signals they aren't the intended audience. Consider a researcher studying Indigenous land rights who searches under their nation's name and finds nothing because the catalog used a broad colonial era heading that doesn't map to how that nation now identifies. Or a queer student researching conversion therapy who doesn't know to search under this sanitized heading, sexual reorientation program. In both cases, the subject heading system actively impedes access to materials that patrons come to the library to find. Beyond discoverability, there's a psychological and social dimension to this problem that deserves some attention. Libraries are not neutral spaces. They're institutions with social meaning, places that carry implicit messages about whose knowledge matters, whose experiences are worth documenting, and who belongs. When the language of the catalog reflects bias, it reinforces those messages in a particularly authoritative way. Research on information-seeking behavior has long documented that role in information systems. Colsal's information search process model, for example, identifies uncertainty, anxiety, and frustration as central features of the search experience. But those are feelings that are significantly amplified when the system itself feels hostile or alienating. When a patron encounters dehumanizing language in the catalog of the library that's supposed to serve them, the message shapes their relationship with the institution as a whole. The ALA's Code of Ethics commits us as library professionals to providing the highest level of service to all library users and to upholding the principles of intellectual freedom and equitable access. The Cataloging Code of Ethics, adopted in 2021, explicitly calls upon catalogers to use language that is inclusive, person-first, and reflective of how communities describe themselves, and to actively work to identify and remediate harmful language in existing records. Biased subject headings are simply an equity issue. Addressing them is not an option for a professional that's committed repeatedly and in writing to an equitable access for all. So the professional obligation is now clear. So let's talk about what acting on it actually looks like. Everything we've covered can feel kind of overwhelming. It's a system built in 1898, maintained by federal entities, and embedded in thousands of library catalogs across the country. But you can begin where you are. And there are 3 concrete pathways available to every LIS professional, regardless of your role or your institution's size. The most immediate action that you can take is simple. Just look. Before you can remediate bias in your catalog, you have to know where it is. The good news is that you don't have to be a cataloger to do this work. Reference librarians, subject specialists, administrators, and public services staff are often better positioned than technical services colleagues to know which communities your library serves, and therefore which headings are most likely to cause harm. The first tool available to you is LC Authorities, which lives at authorities.loc.gov. This is the Library of Congress's publicly accessible database of authorized subject headings. It's free, it doesn't require a login, and absolutely anyone can search it. When you're audibling, you're not just looking for obviously offensive terms, you're looking for headings that other communities that treat a marginalized group as a deviation from some assumed norm. You're looking for outdated language that communities have explicitly rejected. You're looking for non-person first language, like schizophrenics rather than people with schizophrenia, for instance, or the homeless rather than people experiencing homelessness. And you're looking for terms that reflect the perspective of an outside observer rather than the community being described. Search for the communities your library serves. Search for the topics your patrons research most frequently. See what headings come up and ask yourself, is this the language my community uses for themselves? If the answer is no, you've found a good starting point. The second tool is the Cataloging Lab, which lives at cataloginglab.org. The Cataloging Lab is a free, community-driven platform specifically designed to help identify potentially problematic headings in LCSH. It aggregates community input from catalogers and other LIS professionals who flagged headings for review, and it provides a searchable interface for exploring those flags. You really don't need to wait for the Library of Congress to make changes. Local remediation means revising records in your own catalog to use terminology that differs from authorized subject headings from the Library of Congress. Several institutions developed formal reparative cataloging initiatives that can serve as examples. The University of Tulsa Libraries launched a cross-departmental reparative cataloging initiative, working to identify and revise harmful headings across their collection. Columbia University Libraries also developed inclusive description guidelines that articulate the institution's commitment to language that reflects how communities describe themselves. So how do you start local remediation at your own institution, especially if you don't have the resources of a large academic library? You can start small and start where it matters to your community. Form a working group or bring the issue to an existing committee focused on DEI. Develop a simple set of institutional language standards that articulate your library's values around inclusive description. Consider adding local content advisories to records that contain harmful language that hasn't yet been remediated. And document absolutely everything. A reparative taxonomy, even just a simple spreadsheet tracking which headings you've changed and what you've changed them to and why, creates an institutional record that supports future work and demonstrates accountability to your community. The third pathway is the one that creates systemic, lasting change. Engaging with national advocacy efforts to push for revision at the national level. So SACO stands for Subject Authority Cooperative Program, and it's the mechanism through which proposals for new or revised Library of Congress subject headings are submitted and then reviewed. It's administered by the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, or TCC, and it operates as a cooperative, meaning that participating libraries contribute proposals to a shared national authority file that benefits everyone. Critically, you don't have to be a PCC member institution to participate. Any library can submit a proposal for a new or revised subject heading. If your institution is a PCC member, you can submit proposals directly through ClassWeb Plus, LC's cataloging platform. But if you're not a PCC member, and many libraries are not, you have a couple options. You can use the Subject Authority Proposal Form for non-PCC institutions, which walks you through the required components of the proposal in a structured, accessible format. Or you can submit suggestions directly to the Library of Congress Policy and Standards Division by email at ptppp@loc.gov. National advocacy doesn't begin and end with SACO either. There are several other channels through which LIS professionals can push for change. ALA committees and working groups focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion regularly engage with issues of bias subject headings and welcome participation from members at all career stages. There are also professional listservs, like Statho List, that give you a window into the national conversation and can help you identify where your voice can contribute to the most. And so today we've learned that subject headings really are not neutral. They never have been. They reflect whose perspectives were centered when those systems were built and whose language was treated as the default, whose identities were described from the outside in. When that vocabulary causes harm, it's our professional responsibility to do something about it. And now you know what you can do to help. Audit what's in your catalog. Remediate what you can locally. Advocate for change at the national level. Things don't change overnight, but the descriptive language that we use as a society evolves. And therefore, the descriptive language that we use to organize society's knowledge must also evolve.